Welcome to the School Garden Podcast with Mary Jo and Ann. No matter where you are in your school garden journey, whether you are an experienced garden teacher, a novice garden helper, or a struggling home educator, we're here to help you and your kiddos in your garden space. Come and dig in with us because school gardens matter. Welcome to the School Garden Podcast, hosted by school gardeners for school gardeners. In today's episode, we're going to talk about books in the garden and ways you can integrate literature into your garden space. So one of the reasons I'm so excited about this episode, Mary Jo, is you have introduced me to so many pieces of children's literature that I can take to the garden and don't have to plan anything in advance. Mm-hmm. And so I'm excited for our listeners to learn more about these just core books that work really well, whether you take them to the garden or you have to use them on a rainy day.
Sure.
Because our goal is to make your life as simple as possible, and these books can help.
Absolutely right. One of the easiest ways to get your kiddos out in the garden is to take them to read a book. Either as a read aloud, to engage them in the whole class, or to have students spend some time in the space reading themselves. So perhaps you, as an educator, are new to gardens or taking students outside, or maybe even your students are unused to being taken outside and having the outdoors as a learning environment for them. So reading in the garden is the perfect starter activity for everyone. Oh my gosh, I've narrowed it down to 7 books.
I
know. It is, because you know me. And these are tried, tested and firm favourites of educators and children's alike. It was so difficult to choose just a few books to talk about today, but we do have a list of around 40 books that we do dip in and out to during the school year. Please feel free to take a look at those in the show notes or the website at www.madegreen.com, and we've got all the books listed there. I'm going to introduce these books in the order in which they feature in the school garden growing year. So starting in August when we get into schools, and then kind of finishing in May when the end of the school year comes. So for each book, we'll talk a little bit about the book and then give you some ideas as student favourite activities and some extension tasks around it. All right. So do you want to hear about the first one?
I do.
This is not new to you, Anne. You're very familiar with this book. And this is The Sunflower House by Eve Bunting.
Classic.
An absolute classic, because sunflowers are easily the most recognised flower by students in the summer here in Texas, and they are absolutely everywhere. Odds on is that your students will see them all around town, and they last for a long time. They go right the way up to fall. And The Sunflower House is a story that will genuinely get your students' imaginations going for sure. The book is pitched for ages 4 to 7, and I tend to read it with pre-K and kindergarten, sometimes first grade as well. And it's a great read for the beginning of a school year, and it really helps students get to know each other with some of the tasks we do, but also to get reacquainted with the garden space and the garden area. It's a good way to get them kind of walking around the garden and getting acquainted with the space and the rules. Okay, so the story follows a boy who plants seeds and creates a house out of sunflowers. And throughout the summer, the sunflower house becomes a number of different venues for the boy, for his family and his friends. So it goes from anything from a sleepover venue to a castle and then to a cage for a roaring lion. It's wonderful. It also follows the sunflower's plant life cycle throughout the seasons, from planting the seed in a circle to then the inevitable falling over in the fall to the regrowth in the spring. And it is just such a lovely, lovely book. I think it's then great in terms of the tasks we do with this book. We get the students to design their own sunflower house. So either they draw about it or they write about it, or even if they just talk about it. So be prepared for lots of Minecraft references and princess palaces as well as you do that. And if you can, it's so nice to actually take a walk through your garden with your sunflowers, and the kids will start to imagine, because quite often they've fallen into each other and they're creating arches and they're creating these kind of little alleyways through, and they come up with their imagination about what they want it to be too. It's wonderful. Also, sunflower sunheads actually contain lots of seeds. So it's a great activity in terms of picking those seeds, creating seed packets. Also, I like to take a paper plate and they can make their own sunflower head with the seeds. It's kind of colour in the yellow leaves, yellow petals around the edge and put sunflower seeds in the middle and create their own sunflower head. Or even just turning the sunflower heads upside down and leaving them in the garden as excellent bird feeders. The birds feature a lot in the book. So that's The Sunflower House by Eve Bunting, which is a great start to your school garden year. So the second book that I've chosen is called Senorita Mariposa, and that is by Ben Gundersheimer, and I apologise, Ben, if that's not how you say your surname. And the book is illustrated by Marcos Almada Rivero. So we are so lucky here in Fort Worth in North Texas to be on the path of the migrating monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly is the only butterfly that migrates. So as our temperatures start to cool at the end of summer, we start to see these distinct orange butterflies in our garden and around town as they fly south for the winter and again in the spring as they make their way north to spend the summers. They really are an event in our garden, and the kids adore spotting them in the garden and report back about seeing them all over town. They will happily tell you about seeing them at soccer practice, when they were at their park with their families. They really do get invested about the monarch migration. And Senorita Mariposa is a beautiful book to accompany this event. And the bonus of it is in English and in Spanish, which is wonderful. So it tracks the journey of the monarch across various landscapes on their way to the Oyamel fir trees in Mexico for the winter. The topic of monarch butterflies opens up so many extension tasks and activities. So the discussion about why they are in decline, of 400 extension tasks right there, your kids, could include planting milkweed. And milkweed is the only native plant a monarch can feed and breed upon. So planting the milkweed ready for it when it comes back during the spring. Researching the native plants to help feed the monarchs and other insects and wildlife when the monarchs are making their journey, because they do need fuel, from the nectar of the pollinator plants. And interestingly, so Anne and I, you know this, is that we created a story walk from this book to put in our gardens, one of our gardens. Story walks are an innovative and interactive experience, encouraging readers of all ages to enjoy a story in the outdoors. You may be familiar with story walks. Maybe you've seen them at local walking trails or maybe at a different garden and zoos. They're quite popular. So how we created our story walk is by buying 2 books, as the story is kind of on both sides of the pages, so you do need 2 books to do it. And then we laminated each of the pages, and then we number them, and then we attach them to wooden stakes, and we put them all around the garden or the area of interest, where you are seeing these and where you do have pollinator plants. I'm so glad that we went to the effort of doing that, because it was such a hit this year. As a read aloud, this book might only be particularly specific to some younger, so the pre-K, kindergarten, first grade, but having it as a story walk really opens it up to much older grades. And you had 5th grade that got so into it as they were walking around. So really pleased that we went to the trouble of doing it. Then we've got it for every year from now on. It's made, it's done, and then we can put it up. And actually I take it to different schools during that monarch season. So I think it was used about 13 times this year. And we took it to a professional development and shared that with teachers too. So we've added a YouTube link that shows you a wonderful librarian who actually makes one of these story walks to give you more of an idea about what on earth we're talking about.
One great extension that Mary Jo shared with me that I do with kids when I'm teaching this book is to take a map of the United States and Canada and actually track some of the pathways and migratory patterns with older kids so they can see where they go in the fall and then where they go in the spring. We pull that map out again in the spring and we look at those migratory patterns. So there's a way to connect it to social studies pretty easily as well.
Absolutely. And it's so funny because I am not from the United States. So I know. Please write in if you disagree. But honestly, my American geography, I'm brilliant now after doing that, after looking a couple of seasons at the monarch migration. I'm like, I know. Michigan? Oh, I know. I'm so happy that we're talking about the geography and looking at the maps as well. And that really leads us nicely into an excellent project that we take part in every year. The Symbolic Monarch Migration Project is a partnership between Journey North, which is a program of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum, and Monarchs Across Georgia, a committee of the non-profit organisation, the Environmental Education Alliance. It's such a good project, it's worth saying all that. This allows our students to participate in mimicking the migration by mail, which is sending paper monarchs down to Mexico to where the monarchs overwinter, and then in the spring mail comes back, and they're little butterflies that come back in the mail, and our students love receiving the mail in the spring. And what's really exciting about it is that their little monarch may have come from Georgia. It may have come from, remember, Wisconsin, which I know where it is now. And what's really interesting about all those places is usually they tend to be the area or the path of the monarch migration, which is fantastic. And that project is really worth looking into, and we've put details about it in our show notes, and you can also click through onto the website. Very, very worthwhile.
They usually have a mid-October deadline.
They do, to get things in the mail to be sent down to them so they can process it and send these monarch butterflies down to Mexico. So the next book I'd like to talk about is Sophie's Squash, and that is by Pat Zietlow Miller, and it's illustrated by Anne Wilsdorf. And I really love this book. I've got such a soft spot for it. I was given a copy by a parent, actually, of a kid that I taught many years ago. I've cherished it ever since, the actual copy of it. And it's the perfect book for around Halloween. It fits really nicely into that time of fall when everyone's getting rid of their pumpkins, once the celebrations are over, and then squash and pumpkins are starting to go a little bit squishy and a little bit off, and they're starting to get thrown out. And it's this glorious story about a little girl called Sophie and her befriending a squash, and a butternut squash of all things. And it follows the story of Sophie's friendship with the squash and her coming to the realization that in fact this friend is indeed a vegetable. And she then decides to bury the squash, and to her surprise, come the spring, a new plant has sprouted, resulting in new baby squash. And the kids just really, really engaged with this story. And I know that there are lots and lots of books that follow this principle of watching pumpkins or squash rot down and then being surprised when a new plant sprouts again. But I particularly like this because the book features a butternut. And butternut squash grow very, very, very well here in our area. I have a really hard time growing pumpkins here in this part of the world. And it really is because of the squash vine borer, which is this insect that decimates all our soft neck varieties of squash. But butternut squash is a hard neck variety, and it does stand up against the squash vine borer. And as a result of it, we get lots of butternut squash. And I think that makes the book even more meaningful because we can actually grow them here. Many times I've tried with pumpkins, and the disappointment on those children's faces is too much. And then this book leads us to an absolutely great extension task, which is actually doing just like Sophie did, which is digging a big hole and putting in a soft and squishy squash, keeping it watered, and label the area as well.
Exactly.
Because the number of times it takes a while. But keeping that patch watered, and then you too can be as surprised as Sophie to discover that it sprouts in spring, and that is absolutely wonderful. And at that time we usually read the book again because it's really, really quite exciting. I mean, by all means, do the same with a pumpkin. You take your chances, and we wish you the very best of luck with that squash vine borer. Do get in touch if you have success with pumpkins, and we will just hand this podcast entirely over to you. There are so many worksheets and so many kind of resources available online. I think this is a very beloved book, great for rainy days activity.
One extension I did with kids is we just had a coloring picture of a squash, and they could decorate it and name it. And them naming their own squash is just a lovely extension.
When you come to label your squash that you've buried in a hole, it has many, many names.
Yes.
Many names to many people. It's wonderful. The next book I want to talk about is Leaf Man by Lois Ehlert. And this book is a great celebration of leaves. Leaves of every shape, size and colour. And depending on when the leaves start to change and fall in your area, means that you'll probably have a long time to actually incorporate this book into your outdoor education. It's fantastic. Our leaf fall has lasted weeks this year. It's been absolutely incredible. So this book leads us to follow Leaf Man as he goes where the wind blows. It's wonderful, making friends and shapes as he makes his journey across landscapes and nature. It really is just so beautiful to look at, and it prompts children to spot nature and animals in the shapes that it makes. This book genuinely has got all the fall feels. It really does. It just oozes autumn to me. And this year, as I read it with the class, leaves were falling all around us.
Magical.
Come on. I mean, it was absolutely precious. So absolutely so many activities that you can do and extension tasks around leaves, leaf shapes, leaf colours, particularly kind of shapes with younger years, I find, is that finding a star shape, finding an oblong shape, finding a circle, those kind of things is absolutely wonderful, and particularly the colours too. But my utter favourite activity is to have the kids create their own leaf man, or a leaf creature, or a leaf collage. Kids can either do this individually on their own piece of paper, but I find it is much more effective and much more creative if they do it as a whole class activity. So as a class, we spend some time collecting the leaves. Maybe you want them to do, one group gets red ones, one gets yellow ones, brown ones. I don't know, however you want to do it. And then everyone comes back, and I have put a massive piece of paper across the whole of a table. I kind of stuck it down with Scotch tape. And then really, with glue, the students then use the leaves to create their own leaf man or a collage of whatever they want to do, and it's wonderful. So this book itself may be at a level for younger students, but the activity can go right the way up to high school. It really can. And I like it when older kids do it, because then we've got something to demonstrate to the younger kids. They love looking at older kids' artwork. You know, it's very aspirational. But really, those older students tend to collaborate really well, and the resulting artwork is just wonderful. And so definitely think about doing that. So the next book I want to talk about is one we mentioned on the last podcast, the potato episode. It was The Enormous Potato by Aubrey Davis. And this is a tried and tested, beloved book with all my students. In fact, Anne, it was the most requested book that I had during COVID. You know, when we were doing those kind of like read alouds on Zoom and online with our students, I absolutely loved it. It was great. So it truly is one of my firm favourites, and it's perfect for that potato growing season, or to read around January and mid-February. So The Enormous Potato book is a folklore story. You'll recognise the kind of the flow of it from a variety of other books as well. And it's a story of a farmer who plants a potato that grows to an enormous size, and it makes it impossible for him to pull the potato out of the ground alone. So he's got to call his family, he's got to call his neighbours, and he's got to call even animals to come and help pull this enormous potato out of the ground. And then the book results in this celebratory feast when they successfully harvest the giant potato, and it gets shared as a feast with everyone. And I really love reading this book because it allows the students to join in with lots of repeating words. You know, you're repeating the story, you're repeating the names of the people who are helping again, you know, even pretending to chop up and cook the potato at the end of it. Absolutely guaranteed, at the end of the story, it will lead into a wonderful discussion about how you like to eat your potatoes. Guaranteed.
Mm-hmm.
I mine roasted. And you?
Besides French fries,
yeah.
Then baked potatoes. I'm at the age where I have to like baked potatoes more than French fries.
You have to. Okay, if you didn't have to.
French fries.
Okay, that's it. Isn't it interesting as well when we get lots of kids that say, I don't like potatoes. And then you say, do you like French fries? And they go, yes. And you say, well, you like potatoes. Mind blown. It's so funny as well. It's great for literacy, and it really throws up as many synonyms for the word big. You've got enormous, ginormous, gigantic, colossal. Words like that gets presented. And fantastic tasks around this are exercises involving big, bigger and biggest. And
Lovely.
That is a really simple task that you can do out in that outdoor learning environment, or even on your campus. Small, smaller, smallest. And we particularly like making the biggest pile of weeds, don't we?
Yes.
Again. Exactly. The superlative game. And I think that the ultimate accompanying activity to do with this book is to actually grow your own potatoes, which is really, really quite straightforward. If you go to our last episode, we'll tell you exactly how you can do this in your school with your kids. So as we then move into spring, we move away from January, February and those potatoes, and we start to think about those spring tasks. It's a great time of year to start to think about our soil and start to think about decomposers and the decomposition of things that are happening in the garden. And this is an absolutely fantastic opportunity to read this book. And I think that this one, once you have this book in your life, you will have it forever. And it's called What Do They Do With All That Poo? And it's by Janet Kurtz and it's illustrated by Allison Black. And it is absolutely wonderful. And honestly, once you've used the word poo, that's it.
Exactly.
Instant
it is
winner.
one of my favorite books to do with kids.
Instant winner. And you will have your audience at the word poo. And your students will love this book. So much so that for the past few years, it is my go-to thank you presents that I give to any interns or student helpers or parent helpers, especially if they've been involved during a lesson when we've used this book, because they just think it is so marvellous. And this book helps us to think about the droppings, the scabs, the poop that animals leave and what the zoos then do with it. It is engaging, it's scientific, and it is so much fun. And I don't really want to spoil it, but your wombat's poo is cube-shaped.
I know.
A snake only poops once a year. And so extensions from this, I mean, this really does lead you into the world of amendments for soil, good soil, decomposers, things that are happening in soil. Perfect for us is Dallas Zoo, who partner with a local materials company, actually create a garden compost product called zoo poop. We can actually then buy a bag of it, bring it into the garden, and the fact that it comes from elephant, giraffe and hippo poop, is just unbelievable. And here, probably a zoo that they've been to and visited. But if you don't have a zoo that is producing a herbivore compost for you, there are lots of other widely available materials out there that kind of demonstrate this principle. So things like bat guano, cow manure, chicken manure, even worm castings, which really conveys the similar principle about as an amendment for our soil. So this really is a great gateway into starting to think about what is happening in our soil and what we can put in our soil to help. And a great way, and I know that you do this, Anne, is worm castings.
Exactly.
Is actually maybe building a wormery, maybe you've got a compost thing going on there, but you don't have to, because the worms are in the soil and the worms and worm castings are all around your campus.
I found that so surprising when I started at my school is after a rain, you notice these little piles that look like ant piles, but the droppings are a little bit bigger. And to find out that that is actually worm castings or worm poop, and that it costs $12 to $13 a bag if I were to buy it at a box store is absolutely fascinating for me and for my kids. That's that's the way we get that amendment. It's just by the kids collecting it after a rain. What a great activity to do.
Gosh, Anne, this brings us on to the very last choice of the book.
No.
I want to talk about 40 more of them, but we can't. So I want to mention as the last book, The Day the Farmers Quit. And that's by Autumn Pequignot, and it's illustrated by Kate Fallahee. And I apologies to both Autumn and Kate if those is a butchering of your names. This is a great book to finish off your school garden calendar, if you like, and it really starts to make you think about farming on a bigger scale, food production on a bigger scale, about farms, about local farmers, about where all this food comes. You may have probably had a few harvests, you're probably pulling everything out of your garden at the end of the school year as well, but it's great to start to kind of make that connection with the wider and the bigger world. It's a lovely rhyming book, and it tells the story of Farmer Bob, who decided to take a vacation with his friends, and then the boy who embarks on a journey to save his town by getting the farmers to return. It's lovely. And actually the author, Autumn Pequignot, is actually a Texas elementary school teacher, and we don't know her, but well done, Autumn. It's a beautiful book. And I just like the way that it prompts that thought about food production on a much bigger scale and starting to think kids to think about how much we actually need for everybody to eat and the invaluable job that farmers and food producers are doing. And the extension task that I really, really enjoyed doing with this book, from pre-Kers that could draw a little picture right the way through to older students, is to thank a farmer, is to write a card, and we can thank a farmer for the work that they do. For the older students, it may be a great thing to actually research any local urban growing that's happening in your town, all the way up to massive food production and looking at that. I find it quite incredible, the real disconnect between our food in the supermarket and actually how and where it is grown, and just starting to put these thoughts into our children's head is absolutely wonderful. I've been to a farmer's market and delivered these little pictures and letters and thank you notes, and I'll tell you something, it brings you a little tear to your eye. We've just had a couple of days off because of cold weather. I believe our farmers didn't. They were out there doing the work, and it just meant a great deal. Some of our school garden educators will use this as a way to write to their local congressman, or start to look at policy and things like that and get quite involved on that level too. But great way to start thinking of the bigger growing picture, locally, nationally, worldwide.
It's time for some top tips.
Alrighty. Number 1, I would definitely say have a basket or a collection of garden-related books in the garden space. So either during rotations, stations, or free time, students can read a book. Actually, I find it quite interesting that often our older students love to go and choose some of the younger read aloud books to flick through and read when they're out in the garden space. I think having garden books in the area of interest is a winner.
Number 2. Having a designated sitting area for readers. At the beginning of the year, I asked the kids to pick their favorite spot in the garden where I can see them, and that is their spot for the rest of the year. So when we take books out to read, they know exactly where to go. So we have a spot that's our group spot, and then they have their own to read.
Lastly, I would definitely say get your librarian involved. Exactly. Sharing your garden book list with them is fantastic, or perhaps your school librarian could even create a section or a shelf in the library dedicated to garden-related books. And quite often your librarian doesn't necessarily know what's going on outside, so they can't read your mind in terms of the books that you are reading outside. So do keep that communication and let them know the books that you're reading outside.
So that leads us to the end of our episode all about the literature you can do in your classroom. We hope you find this helpful. We hope you find books useful, and we'd love to hear from you.
But I would love to know what your favorite read aloud book is, or some of the books that you have some great success with. And also, what I find beyond interesting is your activities and the extension tasks that you do alongside these books. That'd be really helpful for everybody. So do let us know.
And our email is podcast@madegreen.com.
Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe and share us with a friend. Special thanks to Ben Green for the music and to all our student contributors. As always, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram @MadeGreen, or visit us at our website www.madegreen.com. Details of today's show and other resources are in our show notes. Any proceeds from any affiliate links shared help fund our school garden programs. We look forward to seeing you next time on the School Garden Podcast.